So the purpose of this video is to talk about some of the grammatical structures and stylistic features of Caesar that you will see a decent amount. So the sooner you become familiar with them, the easier it will be for you to read Caesar's prose down the road. Before we begin, I just want to call attention to the manner in which I lay these texts out. Typically, anything that is indented all the way to the left and then also has a highlighted verb, that means it's a main clause. So if you are trying to decide kind of where to begin with a construction or with a slide, if you start with the things that are all the way to the left, that will kind of give you kind of a main overview and the kind of most indicative factual aspect of the text. Then with each step in, it will kind of be more subordinate. So, and anything that's parallel is going to be kind of a similar construction. So here we have all Gaul is divided into 3 parts, of which, and then we have statement number 1, statement number 2, and statement number 3, and these all kind of fall into the relative clause that starts quorum. This last line can be tricky because sometimes Caesar does like to use a relative pronoun without a specific antecedent, so sometimes you will have to add, AE, those who, or in this case, the ones who are called. And also, although this doesn't happen as much as in Virgil, there will be ellipses where words are left out. So here, lingua kind of has to do double duty in the language of them, but also in our language. So he does like to, if a word's used more than once close by, he might only write it once, but you have to supply it in both places. One of the things that's really important to watch out for in Caesar are the pronouns, and especially the reflexive pronouns, to the best of your ability, unless we get into kind of very cumbersome subordinate clauses. Anytime you see a say or a sibi, look back to the subject. So the say here is going to refer back to he omnes, and so that's going to mean themselves. He means these all, but it can be they all. You'll find that demonstratives like hic, hi, kak, and is, ea, id, and alea, la, lud, more often than not, I think in Caesar, especially when they're standing alone, they will be a pronoun like he, she, it, not necessarily this or that. So here it's they all, and they all differ amongst themselves in these 3 characteristics. And these are kind of called either ablative of characteristic, ablative of specification. And as you can see, Caesar also uses some poetic devices. That's an example of asyndeton there. Be careful with word order. Do not always assume that the first word will be the subject. In this case, the subjects are flumen and matrona. And then the Gauls, these 2 are ablative of separation. In prose, more often than not, those will have prepositions, but not always. In poetry, they almost never have prepositions. But here, he uses the preposition ob, and it's separation because there's not motion, it's not place from which, it's just the separation of one place from another. Very often, Caesar will start a sentence, and as a result, I will start the next page with a reference to whatever just happened. So looking back, horum omnium refers back to of all of these things, meaning, all 3 parts of Gaul. So of all these 3, the Belgae are the bravest. We've got a superlative adjective there. Propteria quad is an idiom he uses because, for the reason because. And Caesar's interesting with the way he uses adverbs. I don't quite know how I would describe it, but it's different than other people. So longissime, they are the furthest absent, the most long absent from, and this is a prep phrase here. And here, this is unusual that he uses minime to saipe, least often. That's another kind of unusual. He might say maxime saipe, most often. So he uses more adverbs that modify other adverbs that modify other adverbs than most other authors that I'm familiar with do. we are going to see a lot of gerundives. We'll talk about the main use of them in another section, but most of the time, if you have a gerundive in an odd phrase like this, or a gerund, you're going to translate it verbing. For pertain to the weakening of the spirit. And something we haven't talked about, I don't think yet, is that if I have a to as a superscript, that means this should be a double underline. We discovered last year the hard way that depending on the size of the font, sometimes double underlines show up as single ones. So the to here means it's double underline. So it's not that there's two of anything else except the underline. And if I have brackets, that it means that's a syntactical unit. Very often it'll be an ablative absolute, but not always. So this is just that I want you to know that ea and important are one thing, and then this is its own thing. I didn't want you to get confused by that. Moving along, I think this one's pretty straightforward, except for the fact that very often you'll have to look at the previous sentence to find out who that is. Proximi sunt, they are, and you have to look back up above. We're talking about the Belgae, and qui and quibus here both refer back to the Germanis. So it's definitely important to keep track of pronouns. Qua de causa. Qua here is a relative pronoun, but often at the start of sentences, Caesar will translate a relative as a demonstrative. So for this reason, demonstrative. And again, the reason is what was mentioned up above, that they are closest to the Germans. So for this reason, up above, and then we go into our next sentence. Virtute there is an ablative of respect, with respect to. You could translate it in, again, if you start with by, with, in, from, I would say 90% of the time you will get pretty close with how to translate an ablative without a preposition. Fere here is modifying quotidianis, nearly daily battles. Remember that if you see cum and it's not green, it's going to be when, since, or although. It's going to be in a cum clause, even if it's not a subjunctive. Cum clauses can have indicative verbs, especially if they're more declarative. This is one of these places where suis, because that is reflexive, it's going to go back to Helvetii, and then eos is going to refer to Germanis. Ipsi also goes back to Helvetii. They themselves wage war in the borders of Eorum, the Germans. So if I were labeling this, I would definitely mark up who each of those pronouns refers to. Eorum goes back, of the parts of Gaul, one part. And this is a tough construction with this impersonal verb, but anytime you see a VMA, you're gonna say that. So this is impersonal, so it is said that, and then you're going to be looking to the accusative. It is said that the Gauls possess or obtain. And quam there is the direct object of obtenere. Remember that infinitives and participles can have direct objects and prep phrases. Here's another example of a synditon. There's cultural aspects of septentriones, but you can read about that. Caesar uses a decent amount of deponent verbs, so the Belgae arise from the furthest borders, and then they pertinent and they spectant. So that's pretty much a straightforward declarative sentence. And then here we have again the Aquitani pertinent a. So this is a place where you can translate this as kind of one clause and then add this later. Ad can mean near, and it does in this case, so it's not always going to be to or towards. And then we have the Aquitania spectat, so it's the subject. Even though there's a semicolon there, I consider that all the same sentence.